Okay, our final lesson for this module, lesson 35, is about something called debts and deficits. And as we finish up this unit on fiscal policy, it's important to discuss both of these concepts. And to do that, I want to start with just a little background. Debt in general is an interesting challenge. Now, we're going to focus specifically on debt for the government because that is really the theme of this module for fiscal policy. But just a few interesting facts that kind of give you an idea of what sort of role debt plays in American life. Just to give you some numbers, right now, currently, American households have approximately $11.68 trillion in debt. And at the beginning of this module, there's a little video to watch back on the course homepage about what $1 trillion actually is. Now, take 11.68 of those, and let's just say it's a whole lot of money. That debt, by the way, comes in a lot of different forms. 854 billion of it is credit card debt. 8.15 trillion is in home mortgages, so certainly the bulk of it is in our housing industry. And here's one that's getting more and more disconcerting to a lot of policymakers and economists: student loans. Now over a trillion, so that's 1,000 billion or a trillion, over $1 trillion in student loans. So it's quite a bit of debt has been racking up in the American world, and we're going to take a look at what that does, both in terms of people's own personal finances, but what it actually does to the economy. To understand all this, we need to look a little bit at what these terms actually mean. So let's go ahead and do that. First, I want to start with some basic terms. A budget. A budget is a summary of revenues and expenses. Organizations, individuals, families all have budgets. Sometimes they're formal budgets that we write down. Other times they're budgets that we just sort of keep in our heads. If we're just an individual person, maybe we just sort of think roughly in our head, how much money am I taking in and how much money am I spending? We'll be talking a little bit about the fact that the federal government has a budget. How much does it spend and how much does it take in? Now, we're going to talk about a few different kinds of, we'll call them budget situations. If a budget is in surplus, then generally that's when revenues exceed expenses. That is not all that often that happens for the federal government. In fact, in the last 50 years, it's only happened for a couple of years. So more often than not, this is not the case. But budget surpluses are when revenues exceed expenses. Okay, a balanced budget is when revenues equal expenses are the same. It's an important term, a balanced budget. Oftentimes, organizations strive to have a balanced budget where they're spending whatever it is that they take in. And lastly, a budget deficit, which is the one we'll be focusing on in this lesson, is when your expenses exceed your revenue. In other words, you're spending more than what you're taking in. The term debt. The term debt is really essentially the sum of all of the budget deficits put together. So on a yearly basis, for example, the American government runs deficits. We spend more than we bring in revenue. If you add all of those deficits together, you end up with what's called our national debt. So just an important thing to distinguish between those two terms. Sometimes politicians and policymakers use those things interchangeably. They mean very different things. The deficit and the debt. The debt is the sum, essentially, of our deficits. By the way, just a little factoid, as of April 2014, the American national debt, the federal government's national debt, is $17.5 trillion. That is an enormous sum of money by any standard. Okay, let's take a look at, by the way, just some interesting facts. And this is not the kind of thing you're going to need to know for the AP exam, but it's really just something that I think puts this all in context. Where does the federal government get its money from? If you take a quick look here, you'll notice that the majority of it comes from essentially two income taxes. Now, I say two income taxes because there's what we actually call income taxes on individuals, which is over here about 48%. But you also have 34% in Social Security and what's called social insurance. And that's that column in your pay stub that says FICA, that's paying for Social Security and Medicare, essentially. That's also essentially an income tax. It's based on a percentage of your income. If you add those two things together, over 80% of what the government brings in is in the form of an income tax. The other ones over here, this one we've mentioned in our supply side unit, corporate income taxes. We mentioned that one of the criticisms of supply side economics is that it doesn't have enough potency, enough power. You can see why. Fiscal policy that focuses on income taxes and affects the demand curve much bigger chunks of the economy than are taxes that affect corporate America, about 10% here. So just so you have an idea. And what's the total number? It's important to note. 2.7 trillion or 2,000 billion, $2.7 trillion in income in the year 2013, according to the CBO. Oh, and by the way, again, you wouldn't have to know this, but it's worth mentioning. The CBO is known as is called the Congressional Budget Office, and it's sort of the financial watchdog of the government. It's sort of the group that people turn to when they really need to have a good accounting of what the government's spending. What's equally as interesting is exactly where the money goes. Now, you'll notice first and foremost that last year in 2013, the government spent $3.4 trillion. If you remember from the last slide, we only brought in $2.7 trillion. So we had a deficit of about $700 billion, which is a pretty substantial amount of money. But it's interesting to see where most of the money goes. The vast majority of the money goes essentially to four places. Medicare and Medicaid, so medical insurance that the government sponsors, Social Security, which I think you probably know is the social retirement program for older Americans to help with their income, and military spending, the Defense Department here. The other big-ish chunk is interest on the national debt. One of the concerns that people have is that the interest that we're paying in order to borrow all this money is actually not that bad right now. It's only, and I say only being relative, about $221 billion a year, or only about 6% of our budget. But one thing we've talked about is that right now interest rates are historically low. If interest rates were to rise, that number could rise quite a bit and eat up even more of our budget. Every other thing that we spend, in the federal government, from NASA to Congress to the national parks, everything else just fits in this those orange and blue squares. And really, the other four things, the other three-quarters of the budget, are interest on the national debt, Medicare and Medicaid, Social Security, and the Department of Defense or our military. So that's really where the money goes. And again, you don't have to know this for the AP exam. It's just helpful to kind of have a perspective on where all this is going. Again, some historical information. You can see that our debt has been really rising since the 1980s as a percentage of GDP. Now, we measure it that way because if we just look at the actual amount of the debt, it's not always so helpful. $1 billion debt in 1880 would mean something very different than $1 billion debt in 1990. So one of the ways we kind of level things out and make the information more real is to look at the debt as a percentage of what we're producing in the country. And as you can see, in those terms, especially since the 1980s, the debt has essentially risen pretty substantially. And this has been over the course of both Republican and Democratic presidencies and Congresses, to the point that now we are up to over 100% of the debt in GDP. And what that means is if we did nothing in the entire country for 1 year, nothing, not a single thing, except work to pay down the national debt, we still wouldn't quite pay it down. That's pretty remarkable. So who pays for all this debt? Or I use the phrase who finances all this debt. First, we should actually use that, explain what the word finance means. In any terms, if you're talking about buying a house or buying a car, if somebody says, how are you going to finance that? Essentially what they're asking you is, how are you going to borrow that money? How are you going to get that money as a loan to pay for this debt? So the US government has a huge debt, $17.5 trillion. How exactly does it borrow all of that money. Well, it's interesting to see how that happens. The first thing we should know is the actual tool that it uses to do the borrowing is essentially bonds. The government prints pieces of paper that it sells to people, and those pieces of paper say, we are going to return a certain amount of money to you if you let us borrow a certain amount of money for a certain period of time. Its bonds are essentially a loan that you're making to the government that are, for all intents and purposes, guaranteed to gain a certain amount of interest and then be returned to you. By the way, they have some other names you'll hear. You'll hear the word treasuries, securities, notes, bonds. Any of those terms essentially are meaning the same thing. They're slightly different, but basically they're the same thing as far as the federal government goes. Just so you can see who actually loaned all this money to the federal government, the United States citizens and businesses and other organizations in the United States have loaned out a little less than a third of it, about 5.1 trillion. The Social Security Trust Fund, the money that's been put aside for Social Security for the future, we've actually borrowed some of that money to pay the national debt. Quite a bit, actually, $2.6 trillion. That money has to be paid back to the Social Security Trust Fund so that when the people who put that money in get older themselves, there'll be money there to actually provide some retirement income for them. So a lot of it's borrowed from that. Foreign nations have provided a little less than a third of the money. In particular, two big ones, China and Japan, 1.3 and 1.1 trillion dollars respectively. And that can be a concern to a lot of economists because, of course, when you owe someone a great deal of money, you sort of have obligations to them. And so as China becomes an emerging power in the world, there are a lot of folks who question whether it's wise to have $1.3 trillion in debt owed to China. But as of right now, that's as of 2013, that's where it is. And of course, this shouldn't surprise you. The Federal Reserve also has loaned the federal government a lot of money, $2.1 trillion, because remember, the Fed's main tool for addressing the money supply is buying and selling federal bonds and federal government bonds. So the Federal Reserve, not surprisingly, has quite a few of them, $2.1 trillion in bonds. So this is just a cross section of who we owe this money to, but it's quite a few different places and some places that might surprise people when they realize it. Oh, one more I forgot to mention here, the federal government pension funds. This is the pensions primarily of people who have worked for the federal government or the military. And as they have retirement pensions, that's money that's been set aside again for them for the future. But in many cases, it's been borrowed from temporarily, or at least we hope temporarily, to help finance the federal debt. So, should we worry about all this debt? That, of course, is a great question. And interestingly, it's not as simple as an answer as you might think. First, what are the downsides of a debt? What are the concerns that are often presented? The first one, and maybe this is the most straightforward one, is that the cost of the interest on the debt is going to be too great. We saw in that graph earlier that it makes up right now about 6% of our federal budget is interest on the national debt. Remember, anytime you take a loan, the odds are you're going to have to pay some interest back in return. $220 billion is actually a relatively small amount of interest compared to the size of the debt that we have. So right now, interest rates and the amount of interest we pay isn't really a big deal. But the reality is, should interest rates go up, and right now, as we've mentioned, they're very low, that could be a concern. So it's something that we watch. And again, that's just a summary of where we're at right now. $221 billion, or 6% of the federal budget. The second issue would be that we will not find lenders who are willing to finance this debt. That's an interesting problem. Right now, the American government is still considered to be the most secure place to invest your money in the world. If you're going to loan someone money, the most guaranteed return that you have in the world is still the United States federal government. And as of right now, because of that, there's very little concern at the moment that there won't be people willing to lend the US government money. Having said that, at some point, the government would take on so much debt that people would begin to fear that they wouldn't get their money back. And then they have two choices. They can either not lend the money to the government, or they can do so at very high interest rates, and then it gets more expensive. So that's a concern that we have to watch as well. And then, of course, there's sort of what a lot of folks describe as an ethical issue with the debt, which is that at some point it is going to have to be paid for. And that will undoubtedly fall to generations in the future, probably generations that aren't even born yet. And as we look to act responsibly as a nation, that's a concern for a lot of folks. The question we really want to look at, and actually all that I just said really was just sort of informational, and I think sort of an interesting perspective on the federal debt and the national debt. As far as the economic theory goes right now, the real concern is really essentially these next couple slides. And the question of how does a debt affect the loanable funds market? Because ultimately, that's the issue we're concerned about. How do debts affect the economy? Well, let's take a look at the loanable funds market. Remember, just as a review, we have real interest rates marked here on the y-axis, and we have the quantity of loanable funds marked here on the x-axis. Okay, we have a demand for loanable funds and supply for loanable funds. Well, here's the thing about debts. Remember, debts are essentially negative savings, right? Savings are when you have extra money that you're not spending and you're putting away for somebody to borrow. And remember that savings is what makes up the supply of loanable funds. Debts are essentially negative savings, meaning you've either had to steal from your own savings to pay your current deficit or debt, or you've had to borrow from someone else's savings to pay for your debt or deficit. So the main effect that a debt has, particularly we mentioned in this case the government's debt, is that it's going to decrease the supply of loanable funds. And more importantly, when the supply of loanable funds decreases, interest rates rise. Real interest rates rise. And that's important because if real interest rates rise, that means that it's harder for everyone else to buy and sell and borrow. And that's an important concept. As of right now, this effect has been fairly minimal. Interest rates are still very, very, very low by historical standards, so this concern has not been enormous. But in generic terms, if the federal government borrows more money, goes into farther into debt, then the effect on the economy is that the supply of loanable funds is going to decrease, and therefore interest rates are going to rise. If asked to illustrate the effect of the loanable funds market the effect of a debt on the loanable funds market, this is what you'd be trying to illustrate. All right, let's summarize this lesson. First, increases in government debt decrease the supply of loanable funds. That's the real takeaway point here, and the point that you need to make sure you put in your back pocket. And because of that, interest rates are going to increase. And this should actually sound familiar, by the way. When the government does something, spending, and it creates higher interest rates, if you remember from a couple of lessons ago, we have a name for that. What we call it is the crowding out effect. This is another version of the crowding out effect and what concerns many about debts and deficits, that the more the government spends, the more interest rates are going to eventually rise, and the more that it is more difficult for people who are trying to take loans out to do so because of those higher interest rates. So it's something worth mentioning. Okay, let's do one example together just to wrap this up. All right, the government engages in deficit spending. Show the impact on the loanable funds market and on real interest rates. All right, deficit spending, as we've learned, is when the government spends more than it takes in. Now, what effect does that have? It means that there's less savings available to supply loans to other people. And so because of that, the loanable funds market supply is going to shift to the left. And if I'm to graph that and illustrate it, it will look something like this. Here's our demand and supply curve. We've already marked our real interest rates and our quantity of loanable funds. Here's our initial interest rate. Again, the higher levels of debt take away the supply of loanable funds, so it shifts to the left. And in shifting to the left, real interest rates are going to rise. Okay, we have a few practice problems, free response questions back on the course homepage. Please complete those. And this concludes this module.